Hello, Year 10, and welcome back to your working week. I hope you and your families have had a relaxing, enjoyable half term and that everyone you know and love is safe and well. So, work beginning Monday, June the 1st, 2020. Some very exciting things this week. This will be an interesting week, I think. So, just in terms of retrieval from the previous week's work, I've prepared some whole class feedback on the Ozymandias question that I'd also send individual feedback to everyone who completed it and the William Blake work. And there'll be a retrieval quiz on Blake for you in assignments. And the new work this week will be looking at My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, annotating an associated image of that poem, annotating the poem itself, and then, this is the exciting bit, creating a performance of the poem. This poem is a dramatic monologue, and I think it's important for your own understanding that you participate in that performative action. But more on that later. So just going into the whole class feedback from the exam questions that you did on Ozymandias, what were the sort of qualities and trends? So just what I picked out is the 7 students who gained 100% for the essay. These were really, really outstanding performances. And what I've done is just picked out a couple of things in addition to the poem they used. So Amelia and Juliet both compared My Last Duchess. Isabel and Angus both used London, and Isabella, Sorrel, and Kezia both used Storm on the Island. So these are all interesting and useful comparisons, really unusual and effective choices. Amelia, there was superb attention to detail and close reading. She really picked out every single key detail of My Last Duchess, which, as you'll see later, is very important. Juliet also picked out My Last Duchess used really impressive historical context about Robert Browning and the poem itself. Isabel had a really brilliant point, amongst many excellent points, about how in London there's the impact of tyrants on people in general, as opposed to Ozymandias, a very specific tyrant. Angus wrote excellently about structure in London and indeed in Ozymandias. He talked about caesura really intelligently. He talked about the structure of the verses and how the anaphora in London, the repetition of the cries, is used to reflect the terrible nature, how strict people's lives are. Isabella really showed great understanding of Storm on the Island and the nature of structure and metaphor, particularly Storm on the Island as an extended metaphor for conflict. Sorrel was so good at picking out individual words and language techniques from the writers, and Kezia built a really beautiful argument with the way she constructed it and with the way she wrote it. So over the trends, so we had 28% of people achieve full marks, 16%, 75%, and 16%, 50%. That leaves 40% who didn't submit an Ozymandias essay, and that's a shame, I think, because it's important to get this feedback. And actually, this week on the William Blake work, submission was fairly substantially down, so it's really important to try and complete this work and send it to me for review. It's easy to fall behind, and though I'm acutely aware of the pressures on all of us in this current situation. If you're struggling to complete work, it's absolutely fine to let me know and say you need some more time. It's much better to do that than just sort of bury your head in the sand and not do the work. No one's going to be cross with you. No one's going to be upset. It is really important to engage and communicate with each other. That's kind of the most important thing we can do at the moment. So moving on to some more positive trends, a really good range of approaches to the comparative questions. The exam board doesn't have a prescriptive style. My own preference as a student, I suppose, is to write a comparative essay where I compare both poems in each paragraph, and I might do a theme for each paragraph, such as structure, and then use both poems there. But it's perfectly fine to do a section on one poem and then a comparative section with using the other poem next. There's no preferred style, and that was really good to see in your work. And I think there's more and more confidence and, in fact, skill in discussing poetic structure. So some misconceptions on the retrieval quiz. Lots of people got this incorrect. A stanza is commonly used to describe verses of equal length. There's some debate about this. Stanza has now really just started to become verse, but if we're looking at specifics, it's verses of equal length. And also, going back to Juliet's excellence, the importance of historical context in your writing. So, for example, if anyone used Blake to compare with Shelley, that's a really good comparison. One of the reasons it's a good comparison is both poets are romantics, but because romantics is quite a broad term, they go about things in a very different way. So I think it's important to consider that as well. Completing the following, really work missing from the previous week. There's too much incomplete work to support everyone making the great progress we want to be doing. And then in terms of Dirt, being an editor, I'd like those of you who did the Ozymandias questions to use the feedback I gave you to redraft not the whole essay, just a section, and then upload it into the anthology section of the class notebook, because that would be very useful for you to do. So new work this week. The first thing you should do this week is the retrieval quiz on William Blake and London. As ever, there'll be 5 questions on that, 5 marks, and that will be uploaded for you through assignment. So good luck with that. And again, just some important reminders, keep those things fresh in your mind. The new work this week is on Robert Browning's superb dramatic monologue, My Last Duchess. I suppose the excitement for me for this poem, I love this poem. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think it's a brilliantly constructed piece of writing and works incredibly well. And the 3 tasks I want you to do this week are to annotate an image, annotate the poem. There's 2 Word documents attached to you both in Go for Schools and on assignments in Teams, and then to create a performance of the poem, and that can be sent to me as a video, a voice recording, even a set of still images using, say, Lego or Play-Doh. It's really entirely up to you how you create this performance, but the nature of performance is important in a form called dramatic monologue. So what I've then attached for you, and thank you to Stuart Pryke and his superb work that's used by many English teachers, including me, to give a really strong framework and content for the lesson, is what you want to be thinking about. So this is your first task. On the Word document, I'd like you to look at this image and make some inferences about it before you go further in the presentation. So I'd like you to stop looking at the video now, pause it, and come back to it and do the Word document task to do with the image of this woman. Okay, so having done that, now we're thinking about the poem itself, thinking about the nature of the poem and some of the words around it. Again, these aren't things specifically you need to send back to me. These are just important things for you to think about. Here is some useful historical context about Browning. Again, you can summarize if you wish. Equally, it's fine just to have this information about the learned nature of Browning and his use of dramatic monologue. Another haunting and quite upsetting example is one called Porphyria's Lover. So some very unusual characters. So here is the poem itself. I'm not going to read it. Usually I would read it for you, but I'm not, because I get carried away with this poem. I will read it in an incredibly hammy and over-dramatic way, but it is a really, really fascinating piece of work. It's a monologue from the perspective of a duke called Ferrara, who was a real person, as you'll see in some of the historical context information I've got for you. And it's set in his sort of personal private art gallery, where it talks about his last Duchess painted on the wall looking as if she were alive. As if she were alive. This kind of wonderful phrasing immediately hinting at the nature of this character, the deviant nature of this character, I suppose. And again, this poem is all about the little details. So, for example, who is the Duke talking to? And then, if we look at this little bracket here, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. So this painting is in this sort of private gallery of Duke Ferrara. It's covered with a curtain and no one is allowed to see the painting but him. So think about all the different elements of control and power about that. Now, what happens over the course of the poem is that we learn that the Duchess was, in the Duke's opinion, unfaithful to him. This is all these things about that spot of joy in the Duchess's cheek. And a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too soon easily impressed. Her looks went everywhere. So this jealousy and rage that starts to build up through the poem is what you see in terms of his opinions. And think about how indiscreet he's being in terms of sharing this information. And here he talks about how she refused to be, I suppose, learned by this cruel man. And then this phrase, this grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. Here we almost have a sort of double caesura in the poem. The question mark here, the semicolon here, and then another one here, then all smiles stopped together. Think about what that caesura represents in terms of what the Duke has now done to the Duchess, and then immediately contrast with there she stands as if alive, going back to the poem at the end. Now again, this poem is all about the little details. Now, the Duke is talking to a character who has perhaps some influence, the Count, your master. He's talking about another wedding, which are these mentions of dowry. So he's talking to someone who can influence his next wedding about what he's done to a previous wife. This is not a well-adjusted person. But also look at the fear that he's created in the person he's talking to. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. This to me always creates this wonderful suggestion that the person he's speaking to is so alarmed and so upset by this conversation, or rather this monologue, that he starts to try and go by himself, he starts to try and leave. And this for me is the most terrifying line from the Duke. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. He insists on going with the other person, and who knows what the fate of that other person might be. And then extraordinarily, after this monologue of explaining what he's done to his wife based on speculation, based on his own jealousy and assumption, the poem then finishes with this section here, which I will read out, which shows his ability to switch his focus, his total lack of empathy, his, I suppose, sociopathic nature. Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which class of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. So the last lines of the poem, the Duke focuses on another one of the sculptures in his private gallery. This one, just a conventional image of Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, taming a seahorse. So a very conventional, very regular, impersonal artistic object. And that's the thing that you couldn't imagine him sort of cheerily pointing this out to someone. And I find that terrifying and fascinating. As I said, I love this poem. I think it's brilliant. So keep on reviewing the poem. Keep on thinking about things. It'd be great if people were willing to share some ideas in the Q&A later this week. And here is the historical context of the poem for you to look at. I won't read it over to you now, but just for you to think about and consider the reality of Italy during this time, the brutality of some of the dynamics and relationships. Again, these are the sort of annotation tasks for you to start thinking about. So on the Word document of the poem that I've given you, I'd like you to go through these questions and annotate them. If you've got a copy of the anthology, annotate them on the anthology. If not, annotate it on a Word document or whatever's most convenient and send that back to me. And then just a series of questions for you to go through and to think about. And again, some further annotations just to give as much detail. This task isn't about completing every one of these questions. It's not about that. You can if you want, but this is about using these questions as a guide to give some really detailed, thorough annotation. If you've got other annotation tools you want to use, that's fine, as long as it's clearly detailed, helpful annotation. But use the things I've given you as a guide, but don't by any means use them as an absolute, unbreakable framework. So now the final task of the week, and I just thought, let's try and move away from writing, let's try and move away from the same old the whole time, and try and think about something where you can actually involve the people around you and in your family, if they're willing, or you can just use yourself. So it's a dramatic monologue. I think it's really important to consider this nature. So what I want you to do is create your own version of this dramatic monologue, record it, and send it back to me. Again, if you want to do this in a version where you do something really unusual or interesting, say you create a dramatic monologue of it with Lego and narrate over the top of it, absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be visual. It could just be your voice recording a performance. But think about this, you can use any props you like, family members, sound effects, makeup, music, pets, art, etc. that you like in your performance. You don't have to film yourself, you can just record your voice. But again, if you want to do something that you think is going to be truly spectacular, that's absolutely fine as well. You should be able to upload this kind of file through assignments. If there's any problems with this, please let me know and we'll find another way of doing it, but it should be easy enough. And I just think it's important to try and vary the tasks. You do a lot of writing, in English, and that's great, and we'll be doing more this half term, obviously. But let's start the half term with something quite practical and quite dynamic and quite interesting. You're not being asked to act, by the way, those of you who always look at me with great hostility whenever we do drama in lessons. You're not being asked to act in that way, are you, around other people? It's a dramatic reading of a dramatic monologue. It's really important to consider that. Okay, so just a final thing is some useful terms in the poem dictionary. So some further words. I know some of you like to create glossaries in your exercise books. That's always a helpful thing to do. And then the last thing to consider is this week's Q&A. So 2 questions from last week that people put on the form. Still some issues around subjects not setting work in the way that we've asked. So I'll be following that up with different departments and teachers and just making sure we're getting consistency. Please remember that teachers are setting work from the best of intentions just because they want you to do well. But I'll reiterate again our expectations to my colleagues so that that gives you the support you need. And then the significance of enjambment that I was asked about. I talked with one pupil at the end of the session about the importance of how it shows the stream of consciousness, the reflection of thought in a character. Look closely in My Last Duchess. When is enjambment used? There's a lot of enjambment, there's a lot of caesura. The two are contrasted. And then this week's Q&A will be on Thursday at 11:10, and I'll be there to answer and help with questions about the poem and its content, because it is a difficult, long poem, the context of Robert Browning and how this affects the work, how to answer a comparative question, and I'll be doing some live modelling using a visualizer, which I think sounds exciting. Finally, and most importantly, your Q&A. Please never underestimate the importance and value of your own questions. They're always the key thing in terms of your learning and your development. I hope everyone has a really good week. I'll see many of you, I'm sure, on Thursday. Look after yourselves, fantastic young people, and thank you for continuing to work in such a brilliant, thorough, and invigorating way. For me as a teacher, it's a real inspiration. Okay, take care, everyone. Speak to you soon. Bye.